The war between Ukraine and Russia is intensifying day by day, and it doesn't seem to decrease. Bakhmut and Soledar are the fronts where clashes are most intense at the moment in retaliation for the defeats it received here. The Russian army bombarded Kiev and its surroundings with cruise missiles yesterday. Russian missiles were not aimed at military installations, and many civilian casualties were reported in Ukraine. Against this, the territory of Crimea was subjected to one of the largest attacks in which a swarm of drones was used. Yesterday at night, a swarm of drones attacked Sevastopol, where the Black Sea Fleet headquarters of the Russian Navy is located. After midnight, an unidentified drone attacked Sevastopol. The drone was spotted flying above cloud level in the Severny Bukta region in an attempt to hide its presence from Russian assets. Last night, the Ukrainian army attacked Crimea with 10 unmanned aerial vehicles simultaneously. The Ukrainian military drone was detected by the Russian air defense systems. The missiles were fired, but the Russian air defense systems could not destroy the Ukrainian UAV. The type of drone has not yet been determined, but according to the residents of the city, the explosion was very violent. This shows that a large number of air defense missiles were fired on the UAV during the day. 9 drones were seen over Sevastopol. This is Ukraine's biggest attack using drones, although the governor of Sevastopol, Mikhail Rozvizhayev, claims that the Ukrainian UAVs were successfully eliminated through the Russian Navy's Black Sea Fleet, and also the air defense systems on it. This claim is still unconfirmed. The largest drone swarm attack on Sevastopol is thought to be a retaliation for Russia's missile attack on Kiev. After all, what goes around comes around. The working moments of the Russian air defense systems are seen in the video frame shared on social media. Despite the small size of the UAVs, they were detected by Russian air defense systems but could not be shot down. This shows that the peninsula is not under reliable protection. Ukraine has not yet commented on the attack on the peninsula, but such attempts to attack Crimea are welcome, especially given the fact that the Ukrainian armed forces may try to use unmanned surface vehicles previously used for the attack. While Ukraine typically avoids responsibility, it has demonstrated its capacity to strike Russia with surprise attacks in Crimea far beyond the front lines of the conflicts in southern and eastern Ukraine. A few months ago, Russia said that Ukraine attacked the Black Sea Fleet near Sevastopol with drones, which it said had succeeded in destroying it. In the summer, Russia's Saki air base in Crimea was hit in a devastating attack, which satellite images show at least 8 warplanes were destroyed when Russia's invasion of Ukraine began. Its primary target was Kiev, but Putin's plan was to take Kiev and overthrow the Zelensky government and achieve both political and territorial gains. But nothing went according to plan. State-of-the-art weapons and ammunition were given to Ukraine, especially by the USA and UK. Afterwards, Western states took over the training of the Ukrainian army, and the Ukrainian army became one of the most equipped armies in the world. Russia announced the illegal annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions a few months ago. The purpose of this was to present a success to the Russian public and to separate Ukraine from the Black Sea. This plan of Russia also did not go successfully, as a result of which Russia lost its flagship Moskva cruiser and lost the Kerch Strait bridge connecting Crimea and Russia. Afterwards, the partial mobilization order announced by Putin could not be successfully implemented. Almost all of the Russian youth left the country. Flight tickets were tripled in price and huge queues of vehicles formed from the borders of Georgia and Mongolia. With the start of the war, Russia fell into an economic embargo spiral in which almost the whole world participated. Even as Russia cut off natural gas exports to Europe in retaliation, the economic sanctions have eroded the Russian economy. Russia also suffered its greatest loss of the war a few months ago. Unable to withstand the intense attack of the Ukrainian army, the Russian troops withdrew from Kherson, and Kherson passed under the control of the Ukrainian army. This was a great loss for Russia, but a very important gain for Ukraine. Kherson would open the gates to Crimea, which was illegally annexed in 2014 to the Ukrainian army, and it did as the Current Affairs YouTube channel. All of our findings are created by the work and analysis of our field warfare expert team, and are based on data from the US, UK, Russia and Ukraine, Ministry of Defense, and independent war analysis and monitoring sources. The cost of the war has become unbearable, but the deep sacrifices and hard-won war achievements of the Ukrainian people have all already dealt an epic, epic moral and strategic blow to the Kremlin. As long as the West continues to give Ukraine the support it needs, Russia's military defeat may be on the horizon. Wherever real peace talks begin, there is no doubt that Crimea will be high on the agenda. Ukraine's Black Sea Peninsula is the ground zero of Russia's current war of aggression. Since its capture by Vladimir Putin's troops in 2014, Crimea has been rife with weapons, misinformation, and fear. Its inhabitants are cut off from the rest of Ukraine and the wider world. There was a tendency in the West to turn its back on this Russian invasion of Crimea and shrug it off. But today there seems to be little indifference as Ukrainian forces are now launching a stubborn counterattack and hitting military targets in Crimea. Some experts are urging Kiev to back off and sway Crimea as a pawn in any future deal with Russia. Amateur negotiators like Elon Musk casually consider handing over the peninsula to Putin and calling it a day. Such proposals are too quick to reward Russian aggression alone, which has destroyed entire cities and massacred thousands of Ukrainian civilians over the past year. And the return of Crimea to Ukrainian control is a moral and legal principle that will restore the rights and freedoms of millions of people occupied by the Kremlin. They are too slow to realize it's not a problem. It's also the only practical way in which any peace plan can succeed. The fact that Crimea has no natural physical connection with Russia. Crimea is an extension of the Ukrainian mainland and as such has been deeply connected and dependent on Ukraine's resources and trade for centuries. Meanwhile, Crimea's historical experience with Russia and Soviet rule has been one of constant ethnic cleansing, violence, and trauma. This helps explain why the majority of Crimean residents voted for Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, wanting to secede from the Soviets and become part of Ukraine. If the past has taught us anything, it's that Crimea regressed when it seceded from Ukraine and triggered conflict when Crimea was occupied by Russia. Not underestimating this, history is sleepwalking into a future with more military escalation than the Kremlin. As Vladimir Putin's little green men invaded Crimea, a Russian meme went viral on social media. "Nashor Crimea is ours." This was a classic imperialist message. Bold, persistent claims to occupied territory are what empires do to mask their anxieties about their own political legitimacy. As Edward Said once said, about empires and their colonies, "If you belong somewhere, you don't have to tell or show it." Russia is an expansionist land empire and Crimea is one of its most valuable colonies. The strategic port of Sevastopol is home to the Kremlin's Black Sea Fleet, while resorts like Yalta on the mountainous south coast offer Russian vacationers a rocky riviera, an exotic playground of warm water beaches. But behind this postcard image of Crimea lies much deeper demographic, historical, and geographical realities that Russia has long anxiously tried to hide and erase. One of them is the Crimean Tatars, known as the indigenous people of Ukraine. For centuries, Crimea was dominated by the Crimean Tatar Khanate, a Turkish-speaking Sunni Muslim state aligned with the Ottoman Empire. It was only after Catherine II invaded the Crimea 4 different times that in 1783 she succeeded in dissolving the Khanate and incorporating its lands into an advancing Russian empire. But what Catherine got in 1783 was not what Putin got in 2014. The lands of the Crimean Tatar Khanate it annexed included both the Crimean Peninsula and the adjacent steppes of present-day southern Ukraine, stretching along the coast of the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. In fact, most of the front line of today's war follows the lines of what was once the northern borders of the Crimean Tatar Khanate. Ukraine's recent attacks on Crimea are an indication that the Ukrainian army will try to retake Crimea this year. Considering that the plans of the Ukrainian army and President Zelensky are on the recapture of Crimea, Russia will soon suffer its heaviest defeat. The conflict between Ukraine and Russia has been raging for more than a decade with no end in sight. The war has claimed thousands of lives, displaced millions of people, and destabilized the region. In this article, we will explore the situation of the soldiers on both sides of the Eastern Front based on news reports, interviews, and drone footage. We will see how the war has exposed the brutality, resilience, and desperation of the human condition, the brutality of the Russian forces. One of the most shocking aspects of the war is the cruelty and violence inflicted by the Russian forces on the Ukrainian prisoners of war. According to a report by the Australian, two Ukrainian soldiers who were captured by the Russians in April were castrated by drunken Russian soldiers before being released in a prisoner exchange. The report cites an interview with their psychologist who said that the two men were traumatized and unable to speak about their ordeal for a month. "If there's hell somewhere, it's worse than that," said one of the victims. The psychologist said that the castration was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern of torture and humiliation by the Russian forces. She said that other Ukrainian prisoners had been beaten, burned, stabbed, and shot by their captors. Some had been forced to watch as their comrades were executed or mutilated. She said that the Russian soldiers seemed to enjoy inflicting pain and suffering on their enemies, and that they often filmed their atrocities and posted them online. The report also quotes a former Ukrainian soldier who escaped from a Russian prison camp in 2022. He said that he witnessed horrific scenes of abuse and murder in the camp where hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers were held in appalling conditions. He said that he saw Russian soldiers cutting off fingers, ears, and noses of their prisoners and throwing them into pits filled with rats. He said that he also saw Russian soldiers raping female prisoners and killing them afterwards. He said that he managed to escape by pretending to be dead and crawling out of a mass grave. These stories reveal the barbarity and sadism of the Russian forces, who have shown no respect for human rights or international law. They also show the psychological impact of the war on the Ukrainian soldiers, who have to endure unimaginable horrors and trauma. Despite the brutality of the Russian forces, the Ukrainian forces have not given up their fight to defend their sovereignty and territorial integrity. In recent months, they have launched several counteroffensives to reclaim territory lost to the Russians in the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. They have also received support from their Western allies, who have provided them with weapons, training, and intelligence. One of the most remarkable examples of the Ukrainian forces' resilience is their operation to clear trenches in the southern city of Bakhmut in May. According to a report by CNN, a unit of Ukraine's 92nd Mechanized Brigade used assault drones to target and eliminate Russian fighters who were hiding in the trenches. The report shows drone footage of the operation, which was carried out with precision and coordination. The footage shows Ukrainian soldiers firing at hold-up Russian fighters, throwing grenades into bunkers, and advancing through the trenches. The footage also shows Ukrainian soldiers raising flags in newly liberated villages celebrating their victory. The report also interviews some of the Ukrainian soldiers involved in the operation, who share their experiences and motivations. One soldier says that he joined the army because he wanted to protect his country from Russian aggression. Another soldier says that he lost his brother in the war and that he wants to honor his memory by fighting for freedom. A third soldier says that he is proud of his unit and his comrades will become like family to him. These stories show the courage and determination of the Ukrainian forces, who have overcome many challenges and hardships in their fight against a powerful enemy. It also shows a sense of patriotism and solidarity among the Ukrainian soldiers, who have sacrificed a lot for their country. While the Ukrainian forces have shown resilience, the Russian forces have shown signs of weakness and defeat. In recent weeks, they have suffered heavy losses and setbacks in their offensive against Ukraine. They have also faced growing pressure and isolation from the international community, which has condemned their aggression and imposed sanctions on them. One of the most striking signs of desperation among the Russian forces is their surrender to drones on the battlefield. According to a report by the Wall Street Journal, a Russian soldier surrendered to a drone operated by a unit of Ukraine's 92nd Mechanized Brigade in Bakhmut in May. The report shows drone footage of the surrender taking place in a trench in Bakhmut. The footage shows a Russian soldier running from Ukrainian assault drones in the trenches. The soldier then stops and attempts to communicate with the drone through hand gestures. He throws his machine gun aside, raises his hands, and says that he does not want to fight anymore. The report also interviews the Russian soldier at a detention facility in the Kharkiv region under the supervision of a guard. The soldier says that he was conscripted into the Russian army in 2022 and that he did not want to go to war with Ukraine. He says that he was afraid of dying and that he saw many of his comrades killed or wounded in the fighting. He says that he regrets joining the Russian army and that he hopes to return to his family in Russia. The report also quotes a Ukrainian commander who confirmed the surrender and said that the Ukrainian forces spared the life of the Russian soldier when he surrendered to the drone. The commanders said that the Ukrainian forces had a copter with explosives ready to eliminate him, but they decided to give him an order to surrender. The commanders said that the surrender showed the fear and demoralization of the Russian forces who were facing a strong Ukrainian counterattack. 6. Conclusion: the war between Ukraine and Russia has been a tragedy for both countries and their people. It has exposed the horrors of war and its impact on the soldiers on both sides of the front. It has also revealed the brutality, resilience, and desperation of the human condition. The future of the war is uncertain, but it is clear that it will require a political solution and a peaceful dialogue between both parties. It is also clear that it will require a strong commitment from the international community to support Ukraine's sovereignty and security and to hold Russia accountable for its aggression. In long and difficult conditions, life at the front can turn into a nightmare for the occupying army. Difficult climatic conditions and environment, as well as inadequate logistics and health services, push the Russian army into a great nightmare. Russian troops face fatal diseases and severe quarantine conditions. The explosion of the Kakhovskaya Dam caused great damage to nature, and many infectious diseases that we will hear about re-emerged. If you remember, the main infectious diseases that emerged during the Second World War were malaria, typhus, tuberculosis, syphilis, and smallpox. Governments had taken the necessary measures against the contagious diseases that spread and became epidemics during the war years, as much as possible, but many died from these diseases. Now, Russian troops are also facing infectious diseases again in this critical war in 2023. Fatal diseases have paralyzed the Russian army. Hundreds of Russian troops are quarantined. The flood waters recede about 2 weeks after the Kakhovka Dam collapsed in southeastern Ukraine. But local officials noted that these dangerous infectious diseases are already on the rise. So while the offensive operations of the Ukrainian forces continue, the Russian troops in the areas close to the front line now have to deal with not only the threat of war, but also with the problems of infectious diseases. Waterborne infectious diseases such as typhoid, cholera, leptospirosis, and hepatitis A started to spread, especially due to the flood disasters that occurred on the southern front lines of Ukraine. Officials from military hospitals in the Kherson region and in the Crimea report that every day a large number of Russian Federation military forces are taken over on suspicion of cholera from the direction of Kherson along the northern Crimean Channel. All Russian troops lose their combat capabilities and are taken to hospitals for treatment. A large number of Russian soldiers have already been reported to have died during this incredible period of critical illness. Hundreds of Russian troops are now being quarantined. The reason why cholera disease spread so quickly among Russian troops was probably due to the use of water from open springs, because Russian troops use bottled or simply purifying water in these dangerous areas. When the dam collapsed, local officials in Kherson and Mykolaiv, the two areas most affected by flooding on the Dnipro River, outlined their plans to provide safe drinking water. And doctors and hospitals in these areas have been warned to prepare for possible outbreaks of infectious disease. Alexander Chebatarev, medical director of Kherson City Clinical Hospital, said in a statement recently that trucks carrying necessary medical supplies for infectious diseases such as cholera are unloaded. But the full scale of the disaster, which drained a huge reservoir used for drinking water and irrigation, continues to spread far and wide over time. International humanitarian organizations have shared their concerns about widespread pollution and the possibility of disease. But Ukrainian health officials claim that they are watching carefully for signs of illness. It is also quite remarkable that the potential for widespread disease emerged as Ukrainian forces fought in the early stages of a counteroffensive and sought to retake control of Russian-occupied territories. If you remember, Russian soldiers digging trenches in Ukraine in late April 2023 were infected with anthrax. The mayor of Melitopol reported that 2 soldiers who were diagnosed were hospitalized and the unit was quarantined. While the Russians have been struggling with a dangerous, contagious disease such as anthrax since then, the outbreak of cholera has seriously affected the situation in the south of Ukraine for the Russians, because now that the anthrax disease is on the rise again, along with cholera, it points to a double problem for the Russian forces. In other words, the Russians have to fight not only with Ukrainian soldiers, but also with infectious diseases such as cholera and anthrax on critical southern Ukrainian front lines such as Crimea, Kherson, and Mykolaiv. In both Russian-occupied and Ukrainian-controlled areas affected by the dam collapse, any outbreak can be difficult to combat. However, Ukrainian officials reported that the security measures taken against the flood disaster that almost destroyed the Russian troops have progressed successfully so far. State Emergency Service spokesman Alexander Karunji, in his briefing on this issue, announced that rescue operations continue. Ukraine's Ministry of Health encouraged people in flood-affected areas to drink only bottled water and reported increased water monitoring in these areas. In addition, the Ukrainian ministry has reduced fears about the cholera pandemic by saying that as of last Wednesday, there were no recorded cases or suspected cholera infections in Ukraine. In a statement shared by the Ministry of Health of Ukraine on this issue, samples taken from both environmental sources affected by the flood and from patients with symptoms of acute intestinal infection were examined and found to be negative. So how have the Ukrainians been far less affected by the contagious cholera disease that devastated the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin's army in southern Ukraine? Jarno Habakt, head of the WHO's country office in Ukraine, told reporters this week that the organization provided cholera kits to people in the Kherson region and neighboring areas as a preventative measure in the spring before the dam collapsed. That is, the Ukrainian authorities began to receive preventative safety devices even before this disease appeared on the battlefield. For this reason, Ukrainian military units and civilians on the southern front lines were not affected much by the cholera at the moment. However, Dr. Habakt warned that the situation is still developing and that hundreds of thousands of people are in danger of running out of safe drinking water in the coming weeks. WHO and partners on the ground are also monitoring the long-term effects of releasing hazardous chemicals into the water supply. On the other hand, Ukrainian Health Minister Viktor Lyashko stated that the area downstream of the Kakhovka Dam is heavily polluted and unsuitable for any use, including swimming or fishing. Treatment facilities were switched to emergency disinfection modes by the Ministry of Health of Ukraine and other authorities in the region. In addition, monitoring of water quality in the water mains has been intensified to prevent this epidemic. Last Saturday, the Odessa City Council banned residents from swimming in the area. The Odessa City Council spokesperson said in a statement that dangerous pathogens that pose a real threat to the life and health of the population are found in local waters. The measures taken by Ukrainians are life-saving in this critical time period, when people and animals can even take a bath in these water resources rather than depleting the water resources in the flooded areas. In other news, Alexander Prokudin, head of regional administration in Kherson, announced that dozens of residential areas have been flooded despite falling water levels in areas at risk in southern Ukraine. Therefore, thousands of people had to be evacuated due to the flood. A total of 3,761 people have already been evacuated from the Kherson and Mykolaiv oblasts. However, since both the flood disaster and contagious diseases such as cholera affected the Russian troops much more, the possibility of a change in the Moscow administration's perspective on peace negotiations is being discussed. In Russia, President Vladimir Putin held talks with a delegation of 7 high-ranking African leaders who wanted to mediate between Russia and Ukraine at the Konstantinovsky Palace outside St. Petersburg. The high-level African delegation had arrived in Russia a day after critical talks with Zelensky in Kiev. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, who led the delegation, stated that the clashes in Ukraine should be resolved through negotiations and diplomatic means. The delegation included Senegalese President Macky Sall, as well as the presidents of Zambia and the Comoros, as well as senior government officials from Egypt, Uganda, and the Republic of Congo. Putin, who never admitted that Russia had started the war, filed a series of complaints against the West and blamed Ukraine for the lack of dialogue. Official Russian news agencies shared Putin's critical statements that the Ukrainian leadership did not approach peace considering all this data. Neither side seems particularly open to peace talks. While Ukraine insists on withdrawing from about 20% of the Ukrainian territory occupied by Russia, the Kremlin demands that Ukraine leave the region, demilitarize, and move away from NATO due to its dense ethnic Russian population. However, although this war will not end after the floods and infectious diseases such as cholera that occurred on the southern Ukrainian front lines, at least the intensity of clashes is expected to decrease. Today, new movements began to be experienced on the eastern and southern fronts of Ukraine. Russian troops are in great distress with dwindling ammunition. the disbelief of the soldiers, and the increasingly firm resistance of the Ukrainians. We now know that the main effort of the Russians is on the south axis. The biggest news today comes from the south. We observe that Ukrainian forces have established permanent positions in Kherson Oblast on the east bank. However, the Russian invaders persistently deny this by citing reports and video allegations. The Russian military administration is desperately trying to show that Ukrainian forces are not on the east bank of Kherson Oblast and that the situation is under control. However, UK intelligence and Ukrainian Chief of Staff sources emphasized that at least 40,000 Ukrainian troops are ready to attack in the south. Look, Kherson is still not completely liberated. The left bank of the Dnipro River is still under Russian control, and Ukrainian forces must attack this area to seize control of the Crimea-Donbass land corridor. For this reason, we estimate that the starting point of the attack of the Ukrainian forces will be here at this time. Russian troops in the region are desperately losing ground, and Ukrainian forces have captured most of the islands in the Dnipro River Delta. Today we see that the attacks of the invaders increase on the eastern axis while decreasing towards the south. Let's examine in detail what happened on the eastern front today. The invaders deployed on the eastern flank helplessly continued their attacks from the Crimea position. The defenses of the Ukrainian troops are advancing at the same pace. The Russian forces were able to launch limited ground attacks on the Svetova-Crimea line today, moving east of Sperna. The previous day, the Russians captured Komlosinovka southwest of Svatov. Yesterday we saw the Russian invaders trying to remove the Ukrainian forces from their positions in the Serebryanska forest area, 11 kilometers south of Crimea. But the attempts of the Russians ended in failure. Throughout the day, the Russians continued to conduct ground attacks in and around Bakhmut. Geolocated images show Wagner Group forces making extraordinary advances southwest of Bakhmut to train station in West Bakhmut. The fighting continues in Bakhmut and near Novomarkovo, 5 kilometers northwest of Bakhmut. Ukrainian troops continue to professionally repel the Russian invaders with determination. In the daytime, Ukrainian forces launched the local counterattack northwest of Bakhmut, presumably to relieve pressure on the logistics line through Kremova. The increase in counterattacks continues to wear down the Russian troops, both physically and psychologically. It is reported that Russian Wagner Group troops can no longer conduct combat operations without support. The losses suffered by the Russian troops since the beginning of the war are now dragging them into an inextricable situation. In the images released yesterday from the region, we see that the Ukrainian forces captured the Russian positions north of the 00504 Kremovich-Sovaya highway. The Russians' desperation increased as the hours passed. They continued their airstrikes but failed to achieve their goals. These attacks were neutralized by Ukrainian troops in the east. Attacks on Avdiivka still continue. Lacking ammunition, Russians are having a hard time. As a result of the pressure and resistance of the brave Ukrainian heroes, the Russians are experiencing a very troubling decrease in the number of soldiers.